Welcome to the Left Hook Substack. This is another episode of Chai Talk where I invite a subject matter expert who's far smarter than me to break down a big question and subject. And I'm so happy that today, for the first time, I'm actually talking to investigative journalist Vicki Ward. We intersected at CNN when I was there and she was there, but we actually never met or talked. I was on before or after her. And Vicki, in addition to being a best-selling author, congratulations, Vicky. That book you see behind her, The Idaho Four, which she co-wrote with James Patterson, just went numero uno on the New York Times bestseller list. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that's some really big news. And that book you all should pick up because that book talks about a real life story about a young man, an incel, who was radicalized to commit violence against women. What led to his radicalization? How could a seemingly normal person do that? It's a very topical and sobering story. And in addition, one day I'm going to actually have Vicky to talk about. I'm going to have Vicky again. Let's see if Vicky is not annoyed by me. I'm going to have her back next week to talk about that story because I've been following it for a while and I've been following these trends, these conspiratorial trends. And congrats for Vicky that went number one today. But Vicky, folks, for those who don't know, has been on the Epstein story for nearly 2 decades. And I want to take this DeLorean back to 2003 when Vicky wrote a major piece, or what was supposed to be an expose, on Jeffrey Epstein for Vanity Fair. And in that expose, Vicky had the testimony of victims. 2 victims in particular, if I might be wrong on this, Vicky, please correct me. These folks, and I was telling Vicky right before I press record, I think what's being forgotten, 2 major things are being forgotten right now. We've known about Epstein for years. So if we've known about him for years, why, oh, why was he not in jail sooner? And how come more people didn't know? And number 2, there are actual victims, young girls that were groomed, that were abused, that groomed other young girls. There's a cycle of generational trauma. And I think people are forgetting that. So Vicky talked to these 2 women who were brave enough to come out and speak. And she had a huge expose and she did the work and she submits this bombshell article to her editors at the Vanity Fair. And Vicky, take it away. Tell us what happened. I'm sure your editors said, amazing job, Vicky. You're going to win an award. We're going to publish this right away. Right? Is that what happened?
Very funny.
Yeah.
I think you know the answer to that. No, I mean, look, I will say this. I was pregnant with twins. I had a high risk pregnancy. So the irony of this whole story is that I was assigned to write about Jeffrey Epstein because the editor of Vanity Fair at the time thought it'd be easy because I wouldn't have to travel. Jeffrey Epstein lived in New York. So did I. And the biggest mystery about him back then was who was he and where did his money come from? And the reason that I was suddenly asked to write a piece about him was that he, for the first time, popped up in the New York Post in the gossip column, and there was an article saying that he'd flown Bill Clinton on his plane to Africa, and that was the news hook that got Graydon Carter to say, you know what? I've always wondered where this mysterious guy, who was known to have parties, models all around him, but was an enigma, sort of like a Great Gatsby figure. Where does the money come from? What's the real deal? So, and I did know, I'm American, but I'm a British American, and I had run into from time to time Ghislaine Maxwell, just roundabout, and she was an enigma too. She was always back from some foreign country. We knew that she'd got a helicopter pilot's license. She talked about hanging around with Bill Clinton a lot, and we knew that there was this shadowy Jeffrey guy in the background, but quite what their relationship was, nobody knew. I got to work on this, and immediately there were all sorts of red flags. One being that Jeffrey Epstein immediately phoned me back when I said, I reached out to him, as you do. And there was right from the beginning, it was like this was a game to him. Okay, let's play chess. You be white, you get the first move. And the next person who phoned me up was a guy called Jimmy Kane, who was the CEO of a major investment bank at the time, Bear Stearns. It's not normal for somebody like that to phone the journalist rather than the other way around. Said, "Come on in and meet with me this afternoon." You could sort of tell that they were going on major defense.
Yeah.
And I did find a lot of things about Jeffrey Epstein's financial background that were not, they were definitely contradictory to the story he told everyone, which was that he was this money manager for very wealthy guys. There was a lot more to it. And there were a lot more run-ins with the SEC, and there was a lot more working with people who'd gone to jail and with arms dealers than was out there. And it took me a while, but I did get to that. Whilst doing that, I met these two sisters. I actually met in person the older sister, Maria Farmer, who had gone to work for Jeffrey and Ghislaine. She was of age. Her younger sister was not. She was still in high school at the time. She was an artist who was there to supposedly to advise Jeffrey Epstein on art. And, she and her younger sister went on record with two different but harrowing stories. Maria Farmer said how she'd been effectively trapped in Ohio on a house on the estate of Leslie Wexner, who is the, billionaire who was supposedly Jeffrey Epstein's main financial client and backer.
The head of Victoria's Secret, the owner of Victoria's Secret.
Exactly. And Maria Farmer had this hellish story of how she'd gone up there to paint, and how one night she had found herself sort of stuck in a bedroom sandwiched between Ghislaine and Jeffrey, and had a very unpleasant time, and ended up trying to leave the property, and had gone to the police and then gone to the FBI and gotten nowhere. And how her younger sister, meanwhile, she had brought her younger sister Annie, flown her up to New York. Jeffrey and Ghislaine had been very solicitous of this young woman and said, "We'd love to help you get into an Ivy League school, send us your resume, but we need to get to know you better." So they persuaded this 16-year-old to fly to New Mexico, supposedly in order to get to know her better so that they could help her build out her resume to go to an Ivy League school. She said she had a deeply, deeply unpleasant experience both with Jeffrey and with Ghislaine Maxwell. I kept all this to myself till the final stages of the reporting. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Epstein was phoning me every day, wanting to know what I'd discovered. And he became, we didn't know who this guy was, what his real story was. Was he part of the mob? And he began to sort of threaten me, and he would say, "Vicky, if I don't like something that's in this piece, I'm going to, make sure your husband ggets fired. And that's off the record. Vicky, if I don't like what's in this piece, I'm going to have a witch doctor place a curse on your unborn babies." And that's off the record. And, we began to sort of really worry. Were these idle threats? What were they? Who was this guy? So the lawyers at Vanity Fair said, "You know what, you better start recording him." And he had also asked me, he'd said, "I know every doctor in New York, which hospital are you giving birth at?" And crossed all sort of normal boundaries with me in a phone call, made me feel extremely uncomfortable. And I began to wonder if this guy, he was very, very well connected. He wanted me to talk to, not Donald Trump, interestingly, but he put me definitely on the phone to all sorts of academics he was funding at Harvard. And he put me on the phone, I remember, to Alan Dershowitz, and people he thought that I would be impressed by. But at the very, towards the end, I had to tell him, and I had to go to Ghislaine Maxwell and say, we've got these two sisters, they are on the record, and here is what they are claiming. And one of them does say that this all happened when she was underage. Well, that's when things really took a turn. He went into hyperdrive. He said, why does there have to be any mention of women? Why does there have to be any mention of girls? And what was interesting to me was that, there was quite a lot of business stuff in there, which he didn't come out looking great in that either, but he was okay with that. He was much more okay with that. There was something that was clearly a red flag, a hot button to him about the girls. And he started then faxing me. It was the days of landlines and faxes. He started faxing me copies of letters he claimed had been from them, or written to him, or from their mother, thanking him for his kindness to them. And he sent me a letter from the older one claiming that this was she had he said, oh, she had a crush on me. She's just, making this all up. But they stood by their story. I went out to not only their mother, but to other people they had confided in at the time, including the artist Eric Fischel. And they all said yes. These sisters had made these allegations at the time. They weren't suddenly making this up. We were getting to near the sort of 7th month of my pregnancy. I wasn't in the office at Vanity Fair. I worked from home. The piece was, going through the galley stage, fact-checking stage. And I suddenly got an email from a fact-checker saying, you're not going to believe this, but Jeffrey Epstein is here. He's in the office. He's in Graydon Carter's office right now. And what Vanity Fair did need, this was the heyday of Vanity Fair. It was a major, major print magazine. It wasn't about the digital then. And part of its success was having really great articles, but really great photographs as well. And what Jeffrey Epstein had leverage over the magazine over was the photographs, because he refused to be photographed. And, in order for the piece to really have any meaning in the magazine, there needed to be some photographs. He and Graydon had a conversation at which I was not at. It was then in this office about the photographs. I do not know what went on in that conversation. All I do know is that when I saw the final version of that article, which I saw days before I went into labor prematurely, the farmer sisters, who by now had been exposed to Jeffrey Epstein, we'd put all their allegations to him and Ghislaine Maxwell, had now been taken out of the piece, which put them in a really precarious situation. And, I was beside myself, but at this point, the whole thing was out of my hands. It had gone to the printers. I then went into labor, and I then actually, I think the article itself came out while I was in the hospital. My children were then in the hospital they were tiny. They came at 30 weeks, were in the NICU for 2 months. And I was then incredibly worried that Jeffrey Epstein, who we knew had been very unhappy about the article, would, be making good on his threats and be trying to, somehow harm these little babies. Having said all of that, what I went through is nothing compared to what the farmer sisters went through. And then subsequently, as it emerged, as time went by, as we later found out, dozens, hundreds of underage women. I mean, I later discovered that exactly at the time that I'd been reporting that article, that was the exact same time span in which Virginia Roberts Giuffre finally did a runner from Jeffrey Epstein and went to Thailand and never came back. And I also meant, 20 years later, discovered there was another really, really brave young teenager who was introduced to Epstein at that exact same time, not via Ghislaine Maxwell, via somebody else. And she went through her own version of hell. And this was all going on in real time. So no wonder Jeffrey Epstein went so ballistic when he heard about the Farmer Sisters. And no wonder he found a way to get himself into the offices of Vanity Fair. And no wonder he found a way to get the stories about the Farmer Sisters, which was only the very, very tip of the iceberg, removed from the article. And so, it was one of those cases. And, about a year or so later, the FBI phoned me. And I have to believe, and that in hindsight must have been part, the early stages, part of the case that they were building against him in 2004, 5, 6, the case that ended up going nowhere because he did a deal with the state. As you know, he did the cushy plea deal. And
Alex Acosta, who later ended up becoming labor secretary for Donald Trump, gave him that sweetheart deal in Florida.
Exactly right. And I will be honest with you. I thought it had been so unpleasant. I thought, I hope I never have to come across Jeffrey Epstein ever again. And I just sort of really hoped that the Farmer Sisters were okay. But then we fast forward to 2014 when Virginia Roberts, who's had this photograph of her with Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell with her arm around, suddenly goes public and joins the victims' class action suit. So all the victims, as you remember, they had been denied victims' rights when Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to do that plea deal because they did it behind the victims' backs. They didn't notify them. That's not allowed. That's not legal. So what happened was that, there was a class action suit which Virginia Roberts, who had not been part of the FBI investigation, became part of. And she came out and named not just Jeffrey Epstein, but a whole bunch of other men who she said Epstein had pimped her out to. One of them was Alan Dershowitz. He successfully, after years of litigation, fought back against that, and that case was dismissed, and she said she had been wrong. She may have been mistaken. But she and Ghislaine got into civil litigation because Ghislaine publicly called her a liar.
Mm.
And it was the reason that matters is because the civil dispute between those two, which was ultimately settled, everything in that became the backbone, ultimately, of the federal case against first Jeffrey Epstein, and then, when he died, later, Ghislaine Maxwell. So if you hadn't had all, and the lawyers for Virginia Roberts, David Boies and, Stan Pottinger, were very instrumental in banging on the door of the Southern District and saying, you really need to take a look at this. And as you know, what the things had changed. The political climate had begun to change with the Me Too movement. Julie Brown, had a brilliant reporter for the Miami Herald, had started to really go back and look at what the heck had gone on in 2008-9, how this federal investigation had just been pushed under the rug. And interestingly, a Republican senator, we forget this now, called Ben Sasse from Nebraska, also really started to bang the drum, and all these things came together where finally Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, but we never got then the answers. We never got to flesh the story out, and because of course he died. And then a year later, Ghislaine Maxwell went on trial and was convicted. I sat through every day of that trial, and what was tantalizing about it was that it was a harrowing portrait of a woman with every advantage in the world grooming kids who did not. And because they trusted this older female figure, they were then vulnerable to Epstein. But it was a slice of a life that you knew was much bigger and involved other people. There was tantalizing, they would show the flight logs, Jeffrey Epstein's flight logs, and you saw all these bold-faced male names. But the jigsaw puzzle never got put together, and I was always frustrated. And I had gone out and made a podcast series called Chasing Ghislaine, and we filmed it and made the documentary on of the podcast series for Discovery. But because my question was really about the system of power around Jeffrey Epstein, because nobody who knew him saw any evidence of him abusing, trafficking minors until the 1990s, when he suddenly and almost inexplicably had all this money.
Yep.
And so without all these men, all these famous names who propped him up and put him at the center of our cultural and educational institutions, and who put him in the middle of not just national power but international power, there were no sex crimes. The two things are completely codependent, and so even Ghislaine Maxwell's trial didn't give us any insight into how this web actually worked. And one of the things that always really disturbed me was that the story is more complicated than most people want to believe. This, even among the victims, it's complicated, because the way Jeffrey Epstein very cleverly manipulated his victims was, he would victimize them, and then they were groomed to turn around and recruit other minors, which is why we heard at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, Carolyn Andre, one of them was equally angry with Virginia Roberts. It's why she wasn't called as a witness. And some of these victims had, partly thanks to Jeffrey Epstein's manipulations. We know this, that Jeffrey Epstein asked high-profile men around him. He wanted them to vanish from the media, so he offered to pay settlements to these women, hush money, effectively. So all I know for a fact is that Ghislaine Maxwell was not the only person who broke the law.
But she's the only one in jail, Vicky. She's the only one in jail. There are all these men who went to the island. There's all these men who were friends with Jeffrey Epstein. There's all these men who partied with Jeffrey Epstein. There's all these men who got his money, and that we still don't know where that money came from. But there's only one person in jail, which is Ghislaine Maxwell. And the Justice Department, was just announced earlier today, is speaking to Ghislaine Maxwell. And there's so much to unpack with what you just said. But before I continue, your prediction about what will be said, or rather, and allow me to be leading here, the transactional nature of the conversation that most likely will happen between Assistant Attorney General Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's going to be a negotiation, isn't it? I mean, what's the quid and what's the quo? I mean, she's going to want a pardon, one imagines, and he's going to want names that are not Donald Trump. One imagines. I will say this: in all my reporting, on this, which is all of us are limited. We just don't have a full 360 view of this. Trump wasn't one of the names that came up in my reporting. There were a lot of names.
I lost you. I lost your voice. Yeah, I can't hear you. Wait, Vicky, I can't hear you. We can't hear you. We lost your voice. We can see you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go. Now I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. You don't know what it was. Someone came in on the phone. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Very annoying. It's a glitch. So Trump, So look, Trump wasn't one of the many bold-faced names that was ever told to me either had anything to do with being a client, a money client of Jeffrey Epstein's or funding him in any way. He also wasn't a name that he wasn't one of the people that Virginia Roberts or the other victims named as someone that they were pimped out to. Was he somebody in Jeffrey Epstein's social circle? 100%. I mean,
yeah.
Melania Trump, let's not forget, was a model whose agency considered Leslie Wexner, Epstein's main benefactor, their main client. I mean, so the concentric circles here are very tight. But, I mean, look, Ghislaine Maxwell has plenty of information that wasn't germane to her criminal trial, but would be, I imagine, of great significance and interest to the questions that are being asked about Jeffrey Epstein now. And so, I guess that the real question is, what's the deal? What's the deal?
My prediction, Vicky, is they're going to go talk to Ghislaine and they're going to say, listen, we know you have names. Give us the names Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, and anyone who's liberal. And why don't you go out and say, I never really saw Donald Trump do anything. And if you give us this, then we'll give you a commutation. Knowing Donald Trump, knowing how he operates, and I hate to give him ideas, if I was Donald Trump, that's what I would do, Vicky. But I defer to you.
Well, we know he spoke up for her, right? When so we know that. We also do know, and I've reported this, that when this whole issue surfaced in 2014, 2015 with Virginia Roberts, that Trump immediately said to Sam Nunberg, who was his sort of first political advisor at the time, is there anything, is there anything here that we can use to get the Clintons? I mean, immediately he and by then he had not spoken to Jeffrey Epstein in maybe a decade. And again, the circumstances of that split, we know. I mean, Trump has talked about the fact that Epstein went after, I think, the daughter of a member of Mar-a-Lago, and Trump was furious with him with that. Then there's this story about their falling out over a piece of property that both of them wanted in Palm Beach. But we've never really had a definitive explanation from the horse's mouth on that, which I think is interesting because Trump is not somebody to shy away from talking. So what did you say? A commutation. So definitely Bill Clinton. The Bill Gates one. So I think that Ghislaine Maxwell knows less about that particular relationship because Bill Gates only met Jeffrey Epstein after he came out of jail the first time round. And their meeting, Gates went in, it was actually a different woman. It was someone called Melanie Walker, who was an Epstein protege, who actually became a brain surgeon and was put on the board of the World Bank and is married to the number 2 at Microsoft. She was the person behind Bill Gates who engineered that meeting, which was originally because Bill Gates thought that Jeffrey Epstein knew how to scale the Giving Pledge and introduce him to other billionaires. And Jeffrey Epstein told him that he knew how to work with JP Morgan. I mean, so I think then there are different names that Ghislaine Maxwell, the men around Ghislaine Maxwell were, she knew Leslie Wexner, who has been, very quiet in all of this.
Vicky, if I may, can we just stay on Wexner for a second? Because I'm so glad you brought him up. Because he's still alive. I for one reason, I don't follow billionaires that often. And Wexner is, the owner of Victoria's Secret. And, just trying to, you read enough about Epstein over the years. I remembered that Wexner just, for some strange reason, gave his entire wealth management to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I want to remind people that Jeffrey Epstein is a college dropout. Jeffrey Epstein, as a college dropout, got a plum teaching job in a private college where Bill Barr's father was the head. Was apparently had allegations of inappropriate behavior with young girls, should have doomed his career. But no, somehow Alan Greenberg, right, whose kids went there, said, "Oh, this is a bright young man. Let me bring him to Wall Street." And next thing you know, he's in Wall Street, hobnobbing with the richest people on earth. And then Wexner, this man who's extremely intelligent, worth billions of dollars, right, owns Victoria's Secret, says, "Epstein, even though I know you don't have the background and the expertise, why don't you manage my wealth?" And Wexner's colleagues are like, "This guy fabricated his background. This guy's a liar." And Wexner's like, "I think he's a good man, and everyone deserves a second chance." And Wexner is still alive. I just Googled this yesterday. I'm like, Wexner surely is dead. He's still alive. So, Vicky, what did I miss? To me, this is what the F? These guys can be that generous. And rich people aren't that stupid with their money. So, I mean, what am I missing?
Well, it's even more extraordinary. So he gives him power of attorney.
Wow.
Over, and when I sat with Jeffrey Epstein all those years ago, I mean, the guy, I hate to say this, I mean, it is such a bullshit artist, or he was such a bullshit artist. He said, well, if you've got it's easier to give somebody like me control because, if you've got a difficult relative, for example, it's much easier for an outsider like me to come in and handle that situation. It's much easier for people to fight with me. I mean, yeah, whatever. I mean, what's really interesting, is that after in 2019, after Jeffrey Epstein was dead, Leslie Wexner suddenly piped up and said, well, Jeffrey Epstein had stolen money, stolen like $50 million from him. And I thought that was fascinating because what I have reported about Jeffrey Epstein's background is, he used to say that after he left Bear Stearns in very ignominious circumstances, by the way, he went to Europe and he played some James Bond style role in wealthy Europeans who'd had their money stolen from them. He would fly into the Cayman Islands and fly out with briefcases full of cash.
Oh no! There you
What's
go. You're
happened
back.
here? Oh
You're
no,
back.
I'm
You're back.
back. I'm back. We're okay.
So
Um,
we had you at briefcases full of money that this man who's a college dropout who, as
yeah,
of right
yeah.
now, we
And
have
so,
no idea what skills he had, is
well,
going
so
and
I,
getting. Yeah. Oh no, Vicky, come back. All right, we'll wait for Vicky. Hold on, give me a second. I think there was a glitch. Folks who have just joined us, I'm talking to Vicki Ward, an investigative journalist who we've been talking since 1 o'clock. And someone asked us earlier, says, how long have you been talking to? For about 35 minutes. For those who've joined us, 1,100 people. Don't worry, I've invited Vicky again. I'm sure she'll come back. There you go. Vicky, one
okay,
second.
great.
I was just keeping people up to speed because
No,
now
I'm
we have
here. I have
1,100
one of
people.
my kids is home, and I suspect he's using the bandwidth. I might be wrong. Anyway,
No, you're good. You're good. Okay, you were saying, James Bond
so
type escapades. That's where we left you at.
yeah, so Epstein loved telling, talking up these stories, which kind of sounded slightly absurd, but he did say, but and you never know what with him what was bullshit and what wasn't. He did say to me something that I think was a guiding principle of his, but he said, when rich people lose their money or when they get robbed or defrauded, they don't go to the authorities.
Yeah.
They just want they're not interested in that. And what he did with a Spanish family, this I got corroborated with a Spanish family in the 1980s, whose money he went and returned. He then put it in a bank in Switzerland. There was laws in Spain at the time that prohibited them from having Swiss bank accounts. So
Mm.
Epstein said, no problem. Give me power of attorney. And they never saw their money again. And before he then met Wexner, he was in business with this guy, Steve Hoffenberg, who back in 2002, I went to visit in jail. Steve Hoffenberg was imprisoned for the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. Jeffrey
Remember.
Epstein had been his wingman, and had ultimately flipped on him, given testimony to a grand jury, worked with the government. But what was really interesting was that when Stephen Hoffenberg went to jail, the money in this company, Taz Financial, vanished. Enter Les Wexner,
Mm.
this newly minted single billionaire in Jeffrey Epstein's life. And suddenly all the people who work around Leslie Wexner at the Limited, it was called, find themselves being fired left, right, and center by this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who comes in and throws his weight around. And the next thing you know is that Jeffrey Epstein claims to have made so much money for Leslie Wexner that he's now got his own island. He now lives in the biggest townhouse in New York, and he now has this ranch in New Mexico, and he now has his own plane, and he now has Ghislaine Maxwell in his life with her late father, who's just died in strange circumstances, and he's also a crook, a massive crook. And when he dies, it suddenly emerges that he has been stealing all the money from his employees' pension funds. And his sons go on trial for helping their dad and actually get acquitted in England. But Ghislaine Maxwell is over here. And, you may notice a pattern. So, there was a whole bunch of money in Maxwell's companies that suddenly vanished, along the two. And meanwhile, this mysterious guy, Jeffrey Epstein, is getting richer and richer without leaving any discernible footprint in the markets. I mean, normally when you manage someone's money, you're trading, you can see them, but that's not what he was doing. But thanks to Ghislaine Maxwell, he has access to the Maxwell Rolodex, which, is his leaders of countries, academics in countries, all around the world. And it's at this moment that we know that Jeffrey Epstein starts using Ghislaine, who is no longer his girlfriend or no longer his only girlfriend, and is being in a role where she seems to really be working for him. That now we start to see this trickle of children coming in and out, particularly of the house in Palm Beach, and we now see this sick sex. It's like a triangle. That is when it starts to build, and it starts to build in plain sight. I mean, I'm sure you read the Wall Street Journal piece of last week, right? With those birthday messages.
The 50th birthday, Donald Trump sent allegedly Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday a drawn image of a naked woman, and within it a cryptic message. And I believe that it ends with, what was it? The secrets, the best, something cryptic. It ends with
secret. Yes.
And then he sues Rupert Murdoch and Wall Street Journal folks stands by its reporting. And then Wall Street Journal, again, yesterday, as everyone knows, the breaking news was they revealed that Pam Bondi, Attorney General, had informed Donald Trump in May that his name was in the files. So Wall Street Journal is sticking by its guns and not caving. Vicky, continue, please.
Well, I thought, okay, so Trump was in there, but so was Leslie Wexner, right? With also a sort of lewd, drawing of a woman's breasts. Here's what, I got what you really want. I mean, and I looked at the date of that because it was, his birthday was in January of 2003, which was exactly when I was going through this nightmare with him, which is exactly when the Farmer Sisters were cut out of the Vanity Fair piece. And, I did notice there was discussion about, I think Dershowitz supposedly had written Vanity Unfair, and they were making all sorts of jokes about that. But I mean, I think the reason I mentioned the Wall Street Journal was because you get the strong impression from all of this that what Jeffrey Epstein was doing was in plain sight.
Yep.
That it was not only not a secret that he was trafficking and abusing children. It was a punchline. That's the extraordinary thing.
And these men were joking with each other. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like they were in a frat. This was the little secret. And the victims are real folks. And you mentioned a name. I just want to bring it back up. You mentioned so much, Vicky. It's the great, when you're interviewing people, folks, you always want a great guest. You just have to set them up and they do all the work. So that's what happened today, which was fantastic because Vicky has all the goods and the receipts. Virginia Jeffrey, right? She was 41 years old. She was the one who came out and talked about probably one of the most prominent victims, and who basically said Prince Andrew was part and parcel of this cabal of wealthy, powerful men who preyed on young girls. It took incredible bravery, and people forget, and they shouldn't forget, that she died by suicide in April, just a few months ago, folks. So these victims are real, and these men. And we know there are men, so many men, and the money trail brings up so many connections, right? Like why? Why did Wexner give this man money? Why did Bill Barr's dad hire a man who's a college dropout? Why did Bill Gates talk to this person? Is Bill Clinton's name in there? Why was Donald Trump, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, doing it? Why did Alan Dershowitz? Like, it's all these men, powerful, wealthy men. None of them are in jail, but Ghislaine is in jail right now. And I want to ask you this, Vicky. This just came out. This article just came out in the New York Times. It's an op-ed piece by a journalist who covered Epstein, Barry Levine. And his book is The Spider, Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And specifically, he says, these are 9 questions we actually need answered. So I just want to list these questions that he has, and I want to give it to you. The first question is, how did Epstein make his money? And how did he finance his sex trafficking over 2 decades? Second question, Did Epstein have any ties to spy agencies? Third, are there references to Trump in files that add to our knowledge of his relationship with Epstein? Four, what about Bill Clinton? Five, who are the clients implicated in Epstein's sex trafficking operation? Six, who helped Epstein overseas? Seven, what did investigators find in Epstein's safe, computers, and other property? Eight, what do the videos show? And finally, what is in Epstein's autopsy report? I spin the wheel of those 9 questions and I give it to you. Which one do you want to answer or tackle?
Oh, um, well, because the one that we haven't really even touched on is the spy thing, right? Um, Here's what we know. Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, was a spy. And he for many countries, but the very fact that he is buried on the Mount of Olives, a sort of hero's burial in Israel, is, very telling. I mean, that was part of what he did, and very cleverly, one of the ways he acted as an intelligence agent. He had this publishing company that published academic journals, the Pergamon Press, that had um, branches in different countries. And actually, if you really want to know what a country is doing in terms of developing weapons and technology and things like that, the academics all put it in scientific journals, which is what the Pergamon Press published. So it was actually, again, he was moving information kind of in plain sight, actually. But you have to remember, I mean, this is a guy who had been a politician in England. He had tight relationships with leaders in Israel, in Bulgaria, in Russia, and here he had bought a newspaper here in New York. I mean, the guy was seriously plugged in. Jeffrey Epstein didn't need to be on a government intelligence agency payroll. Intelligence works in numerous different ways. And if you are basically controlling the money, as Jeffrey Epstein was, of the richest Zionist in America, that would be Leslie Wexner. And if you have access to Bill Clinton, perhaps because of your girlfriend or employee, and therefore you are able to go into the White House and talk in a friendly way to the American president who's considering what to do in the Middle East, you don't need to be working for Mossad. Right there, you are what they call an influencer asset. And so, and Jeffrey Epstein, given that he also had an apartment in Paris, which is where a lot of the heads of the Gulf states go to vacation, we know that he was he hosted in his home the now Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. We know that he knew the Gaddafi family in Libya. We know that he was able to pass whatever he wanted.
No. Oh, there you go. You're back. You're
Sorry
back. It's a conspiracy. They're trying to shut Vicky down, but we won't let them.
I know. No, I think I need to switch out my internet providers. The really boring truth. But so he was in a position to pass information and to communicate between countries at a time when they weren't communicating. I mean, when Jeffrey Epstein was able to, there was a period where, the Israelis were definitely not talking to the Saudis. Jeffrey Epstein was somebody, they call them hyperfixers, in that, who can talk to both sides, without causing, trouble. And let's not forget his relationship with Prince Andrew. What's going on at a time when Prince Andrew was the British trade envoy, which again puts Jeffrey Epstein, um, right at the seat of a lot of important trade negotiations. What one has to wonder is what Jeffrey Epstein got out of all of this. For him, Steve Hoffenberg, his former mentor, who's now dead, the guy who was in jail, was very clear with me that he had taught Jeffrey everything he knew, and that what Jeffrey basically did was operate a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
And he had, not a huge number of wealthy clients, but a small number, big enough to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul. And what he would do is he would tell them, he come up with very creative ideas for tax shelters and so on. He put their money offshore. But once you put the money offshore, we go back to what happened with the Spanish family and what happened, according to Leslie Wexner. Once it's offshore, it's offshore. And yes, and I mean, there are certainly stories, and Jeffrey Epstein was right. I mean, I do know of at least 2 examples of very wealthy people who trusted Jeffrey Epstein with their money and who've never gone public about it, but came out of the experience, or their heirs came out of the experience, considerably worse off.
And you can't name them.
No, because they have talked to me off the record, but so I know that I know that there is a trail of destruction out there, and one of the things I had always hoped for was that the government would go after Jeffrey Epstein's money, because I actually thought that's the avenue that ultimately would produce the most clarifying results in terms of who was he really, and what was, and who else was in the web, and why, and what was going on. But the problem with that, and you know this better than me because of your law background, is that the government only brings cases it thinks it can win, and going after money that's been put offshore is really difficult and possibly not fruitful. So
And
that hasn't happened.
Lev Parnas, first of all, told me to say hi to you. I was talking to him yesterday, and he also said, follow the money.
Yeah.
And I think it was Senator Wyden also now. When he
Yes.
does investigations, he has a great track record. He's following the money because Epstein, how did he make his money? And I saw your interview with Michael Wolff. I recommend people seeing it, where Mike Wolff said it's remarkable how this man, who I've never seen in all my interactions actually work, was worth billions of dollars, right? The money trail, I think, is what will really, really, if you will, expose the very powerful men who have benefited from Epstein, who have helped Epstein, who probably have more answers that we need. And again, folks, I want to remind people that there's only one woman right now, Ghislaine Maxwell, who's in prison, and she's being visited by Trump's Justice Department. I wonder what's the quid pro quo. I was supposed to keep Vicky for only 30 minutes, but I could talk to her for another hour. I have to talk to God in 5 minutes. We're talking for the first time. But Vicky, I hope everyone enjoyed listening to Vicky. If Vicky has the time or appetite, I'd love to talk to you next week about 2 things. Number one, just to talk about some of the issues we didn't mention, because Vicky, for those who have joined us, nearly 1,400 people, we've been talking since 1 p.m. Vicki Ward is an investigative journalist who, while she was pregnant with twins, followed the cookie crumbs, and because she's a good reporter, said, there's more to this story about this Epstein guy. And then she found these 2 sisters who were willing to risk their neck and come out publicly 20 years ago and expose Epstein, and because there were victims. She gave that article to Vanity Fair, and voila, let it be known that all that information about the victims was scrubbed. And she was threatened by Epstein. And thank you for sharing with that. I had no idea you went through that. That is extremely traumatic. You're putting on a very brave face. But what that happened was, if there was a man like Epstein calling me up and threatening me and my children, I think all of us here would be terrified. I didn't know you went through that. I'm so sorry. But she's been on it. And she was also at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. She has a fantastic audiobook on it called Chasing Ghislaine Maxwell. And then she's asking the same questions we've been asking, but she's been on it for 20 years, folks. I want to have her on next week if she is not tired of me or annoyed by me. And the conspiracy of her internet, we will fix. But before I let you go, Vicky, shamelessly promote yourself, and also please shamelessly promote that book to your right, which I really want. I want to talk to about you next week. Now that you said yes, you'll talk to me next week. I want to
Yes.
pick up a conversation on Epstein, but I also want to talk about this book because I think it's very, very topical and salient, and it just hit #1 on the bestseller list. Vicky,
Yeah.
shamelessly promote yourself and the book.
Well, look, the story of Epstein is fascinating, and I would love to come on and talk more. I mean, because there is so much that we need to still find out. Yes, the book. Where is it? This way. The Idaho Four, co-authored with the great James Patterson. If many of you may have noticed, there was a very, very emotional day in court in Boise, Idaho yesterday, where this heinous sociopathic murderer, Brian Koberger, was finally sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail. We hope there's more to that. And the families of the victims stood up, some of them addressing him directly, which they've been told not to do ahead of time. Some of them were worried. I just spoke to them this morning that they were going to actually be arrested, but they spoke to him in some cases and told him what they thought of him. But it's an extraordinary story. The book is not just about these awful murders of 4 beautiful college kids. It's the story of a liberal college town in a deeply Republican state in Ohio that was simmering with political and cultural and social tensions when the murders happened, and how the murders completely tore the place apart. And it is still recovering.
Mm. And it just hit #1. I hope you can come back next week to talk about that. I'd like to focus on that. And then if we have some time, I'd like to expand on this conversation. And folks, Vicky has a Substack. Subscribe to Vicky's Substack, follow her work. She also has a YouTube channel, which only has 3,000 subscribers. So you need to go subscribe to her YouTube channel. You should hire me as your publicist, Vicky.
I will.
This
I didn't even know that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you have a YouTube channel and you have 3,750 subscribers. I'm like, there's some fantastic interviews here. She should have 37,000 and then 370,000. But subscribe to Vicky's Substack, buy the book, which is a bestseller. You hear here first that she will come on next week. So I will follow her up on this, and hopefully she comes back. For the nearly 1,400 people who are watching, this has been The Left Hook, where I've been talking to Vicky for the past hour about her 20 years of research on Jeffrey Epstein, his victims, and Ghislaine Maxwell. The entire conversation will be up in about an hour or two. This has been The Left Hook Substack. I don't believe in paywalls because I'm a terrible capitalist. My immigrant dad cries. But I keep everything for free because I believe democracy dies in darkness. If you have a few bucks, folks, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. I have like 700 kids. I got to feed them. I'm independent. And if you don't have the money, at the very least, listen to Vicky. Just a fantastic interview. I could have heard her for another hour. I really appreciate Vicky spending this much time. Thanks, Vicky. And tell your son I'm sorry that we ate his bandwidth as he's probably playing video games. Uh,
Thanks,
we'll have this up on The Left Hook. And again, subscribe to Vicky's Substack. And I'm going to have Vicky again next week. I'll announce it. Vicky, thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye.